The Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, sir, 7 weeks ago today, the Argentine Foreign Minister summoned the British ambassador in Buenos Aires and informed him that the diplomatic channel was now closed. Later that same day, President Reagan appealed to President Galtieri not to invade the Falkland Islands. That appeal was rejected. Ever since the 2nd of April, Argentina has continued to defy the mandatory resolution of the Security Council. During the past 24 hours, the crisis over the Falkland Islands has moved into a new and even more serious phase. On Monday of this week, our ambassador to the United Nations handed to the Secretary General our proposals for a peaceful settlement of the dispute. These proposals represented the limit to which the government believed it was right to go. We made it clear to Senator Perez de Cuellar that we expected the Argentine government to give us a very rapid response to them. By yesterday morning, we'd had a first indication of the Argentinian reaction. It was not encouraging. By the evening, we received their full response in writing. Mr. Speaker, it was in effect a total rejection of the British proposals. Indeed, in many respects, the Argentinian reply went back to their position when they rejected Mr. Hague's second set of proposals on the 29th of April. It retracted virtually all the movement their representative had shown during the Secretary General's efforts to find a negotiated settlement. I shall have some more to say about his efforts later. The implications of the Argentinian response are of the utmost gravity. That's why the government decided to publish immediately the proposals we had put to the Secretary General and to give the House the earliest opportunity to consider them. These proposals were placed in the vote office earlier today. The government believes that they represented a truly responsible effort to find a peaceful solution which both preserved the fundamental principles of our position and offered the opportunity to stop further loss of life in the South Atlantic. We have reached this very serious situation because the Argentines clearly decided at the outset of the negotiations that they would cling to the spoils of invasion and occupation by thwarting at every turn all the attempts that have been made to solve the conflict by peaceful means. Ever since the 2nd of April, they have responded to the efforts to find a negotiated solution with obduracy and delay, deception and bad faith. We've now been negotiating for 6 weeks. The House will recall the strenuous efforts made over an extended period by Secretary of State Hague. During that period, my ministerial colleagues and I considered no less than 4 sets of proposals. Although these presented substantial difficulties, we did our best to help Mr. Hague continue his mission until Argentine rejection of his last proposals left him no alternative but to abandon his efforts. The next stage of negotiations was based on proposals originally advanced by President Belaunde of Peru and modified in consultations between him and Mr. Hague. As my right honourable friend informed the House on the 7th of May, Britain was willing to accept these, the 5th set of proposals, for an interim settlement. They could have led to an almost immediate ceasefire. But again, it was Argentina who rejected them. I shall not take up the time of the House with a detailed description of those earlier proposals, partly because they belong to those who devised them, but more importantly, because they are no longer on the negotiating table. Britain is not now committed to them. Since the 6th of May, when it became clear that the United States Peruvian proposals were not acceptable to Argentina, the United Nations Secretary General, Senor Perez de Cuellar, has been conducting negotiations with Britain and Argentina. Following several rounds of discussions, the United Kingdom representative at the United Nations was summoned to London for consultation last Sunday. On Monday, Sir Anthony Parsons returned to New York and presented to the Secretary-General a draft interim agreement between Britain and Argentina, which set out the British position in full. He made clear that the text represented the furthest that Britain could go in the negotiations. He requested that the draft should be transmitted to the Argentine representative and that he should be asked to convey his government's response within 2 days. Yesterday we received the Argentine government's reply. As I have said, it amounted to a rejection of our own proposals, and we have so informed the Secretary-General. This morning we have received proposals from the Secretary-General himself. It will help the House to understand the present position if I now describe briefly these 3 sets of proposals. I deal first with our own proposals. These preserve the fundamental principles which are the basis of the government's position. Aggression must not be allowed to succeed. International law must be upheld. Sovereignty cannot be changed by invasion, and the liberty of the Falkland Islanders must be restored. For years they've been free to express their own wishes about how they want to be governed. They've had institutions of their own choosing. They've enjoyed self-determination. Why should they lose that freedom and exchange it for dictatorship? Mr. Speaker, our proposals are contained in 2 documents. First and mainly, there's the draft interim agreement between ourselves and Argentina. Second, a letter to the Secretary-General, which makes it clear that the British government does not regard the draft interim agreement as covering the dependencies of South Georgia and the South Sandwich Islands. Now, I deal with the dependencies first. South Georgia and South Sandwich Islands are geographically distant from the Falkland Islands themselves. They've no settled population. British title to them does not derive from the Falkland Islands, but is separate. These territories have been treated as dependencies of the Falkland Islands only for reasons of administrative convenience. That's why they are outside the draft agreement. The House has before it the draft agreement, and I turn now to its main features. Article 2 provides for the cessation of hostilities and the withdrawal of Argentine and British forces from the island and their surrounding waters within 14 days. At the end of the withdrawal, British ships would be at least 150 nautical miles from the islands. Withdrawal much beyond this would not have been reasonable, because the proximity of the Argentinian mainland would have given their forces undue advantage. Mr. Speaker, withdrawal of the Argentinian forces would be the most immediate and explicit sign that their government's aggression had failed and that they were being made to give up what they had gained by force. It is the essential beginning of a peaceful settlement and the imperative of Resolution 502. Article 6 sets out the interim arrangements under which the islands would be administered in the period between the cessation of hostilities and the conclusion of negotiations on the long-term future of the islands. In this interim period, there would be a United Nations administrator appointed by the Secretary-General and acceptable to Britain and the Argentine. He would be the officer administering the government. Under Clause 3 of this article, he would exercise his powers in conformity with the laws and practices traditionally obtaining in the islands. He would consult the islands' representative institutions, that is, the legislative and executive councils through which the islanders were governed until the 2nd of April. There would be, in addition to each of the 2 councils, of 1 representative of the 20 or 30 Argentines normally resident in the islands. Their representatives would be nominated by the administrator. Mr. Speaker, this clause has been carefully drawn so that the interim administration cannot make changes in the law and customs of the islanders that would prejudge the outcome of the negotiations on a long-term settlement. This provision would not only go a long way to giving back to the Falklanders the way of life they have always enjoyed, but would prevent an influx of Argentine settlers in the interim period, whose residence would change the nature of society there and radically affect the future of the islands. That would not have been a true interim administration. It would have been an instrument of change. Clause 3 of this article thus fully safeguards the future of the islands. Nothing in this interim administration would compromise the eventual status of the Falklands or the freedom which they have enjoyed for so long. Clause 4 of Article 6 would require the administrator to verify the withdrawal of all forces from the islands and to prevent their reintroduction. I give way for a moment to the Right Honourable Gentleman.
I'm most grateful. Could the Prime Minister just help the House by clarifying one point? She said on the Jimmy Young radio programme the other day that she did not like the word veto as applied to the Falkland Islands. Is the government's present position that the Falkland Islanders will be consulted or that their views are still paramount? Could you help on that?
Mr. Speaker, I am dealing with the arrangements for the interim between the cessation of hostilities and the negotiations. The Right Honourable Gentleman will notice that we have imported into this agreement Article 73, which refers to the paramountcy of the interests of the islanders. Of course, during the long-term negotiations, we should closely consult the wishes of the islanders, and of course, we believe in self-determination. That relates to the long-term negotiations. These articles are dealing with the interim administration, and I've been trying to make clear that the interim administration must not have provisions within it which in effect preempt the outcome of the long-term negotiations. Mr. Speaker, if I might just return to Clause 4 of Article 6, we think it likely that the administrator would need to call upon the help of 3 or 4 countries, other than ourselves and the Argentines, to provide him with the necessary equipment and a small but effective force. The purpose of that is that if our troops leave the islands, we must have some way of guarding against another Argentinian invasion, and the safest way under these arrangements, we thought, would be for the United Nations administrator to have a small United Nations force at his disposal of the kind which I have described. Mr. Speaker, Articles 8 and 9 are also very important. They deal with negotiations between Britain and Argentina on the long-term future of the islands. The key sentence is the one which reads, "These negotiations shall be initiated without prejudice to the rights, claims and positions of the parties and without prejudgment of the outcome." We should thus be free to take fully into account the wishes of the islanders themselves, and Argentina would not be able to claim that the negotiations had to end with a conclusion that suited her.
But surely it's implicit in those words that if the rights and claims of the Argentinians are being considered, that the outcome of the negotiations may well be that we would cede sovereignty to Argentina.
What I have said is that we do not prejudge the outcome. If the wishes of the islanders were to go to Argentina, I believe that this country would uphold the wishes of the islanders. I doubt very much indeed whether the wishes of the islanders after their experience will be anything near that particular wish. Indeed, I believe that they would recoil from it. Now, we are on Article 9. We have to recognise that the negotiations might be lengthy. And that's why Article 9 provides that until the final agreement had been reached and implemented, the interim agreement would remain in force. Mr. Speaker, although this interim agreement does not restore things fully to what they were before the Argentinian invasion, it is faithful to the fundamental principles I outlined earlier. Had the Argentines accepted our proposals, we should have achieved the great prize of preventing further loss of life. And it was with this in mind that we were prepared to make practical changes that were reasonable, but we were not prepared to compromise on principle. Mr. Speaker, I now turn to the Argentinian response. This revived once again all the points which had been obstacles in earlier negotiations. Their draft interim agreement applied not only to the Falklands, but included South Georgia and the South Sandwich Islands as well. They demanded that all forces should withdraw, including our forces on South Georgia, and return to their normal bases and areas of operation. This was plainly calculated to put us at an enormous disadvantage. They required that the interim administration should be the exclusive responsibility of the United Nations, which should take over all executive, legislative, judicial and security functions in the islands. They rejected any role for the islands' democratic institutions. They envisaged that the interim administration would appoint as advisors equal numbers of British and Argentine residents of the islands, despite their huge disparity. They required freedom of movement and equality of access with regard to residence, work and property for Argentine nationals on an equal basis with the Falkland Islanders. The Junta's clear aim was to flood the islands with their own nationals during the interim period and thereby change the nature of Falkland society and so prejudge the future of the islands. With regard to negotiations for a long-term settlement, while pretending not to prejudice the outcome, they stipulated that the object was to comply not only with the Charter of the United Nations, but with various resolutions of the General Assembly, from some of which the United Kingdom dissented on the grounds that they favoured Argentine sovereignty. And if the period provided for the completion of the negotiation expired, they demanded that the General Assembly should determine the lines to which final agreement should conform. Mr. Speaker, it was manifestly impossible for Britain to accept such demands. Argentina began this crisis. Argentina has rejected proposal after proposal. One is bound to ask whether the junta have ever intended to seek a peaceful settlement, or whether they have sought merely to confuse and prolong the negotiations by remaining in illegal possession of the islands. I believe that if we had a dozen more negotiations, the tactics and the results would be the same. From the course of these negotiations and Argentina's persistent refusal to accept Resolution 502, we are bound to conclude that her objective is procrastination and continuing occupation, leading eventually to sovereignty.
For giving way, I'm sorry to interrupt her, but do we understand that the proposed interim agreement, like some earlier proposals, is no longer on the table, having regard to the fact that provisions, or proposed provisions, for the withdrawal of British forces and a non-British administration have consequences for British sovereignty and for the principles for which the task force was dispatched?
Mr. Speaker, these proposals have been rejected. They are no longer on the table. Mr. Speaker, as I said earlier, the Secretary-General has this morning put to us and to Argentina an aide-memoire describing those issues where, in his opinion, agreements seem to exist and those on which differences remain. The first group of issues, those where he believes there is a measure of agreement, would require further clarification, for on some points our interpretation would be different. The aide-memoire states, for example, that Argentina would accept long-term negotiations without prejudgment of the outcome. This important phrase was, however, omitted from the Argentine response to our own proposals and is belied by a succession of statements from Buenos Aires. Those points where, in the Secretary-General's judgment, differences remain include, first, aspects of the interim administration, Second, the timetable for completion of negotiations and the related duration of the interim administration. Third, aspects of the mutual withdrawal of forces. Fourth, the geographic area to be covered. Senor Perez de Cuellar has proposed formulations to cover some of these points. Mr. Speaker, the Secretary-General, to whose efforts I pay tribute, has a duty to continue to seek agreement. But as our representative is telling him in New York, his paper differs in certain important respects from our position as presented to him on the 17th of May, and which we then described as the furthest we could go. Moreover, it differs fundamentally from the present Argentine position as communicated to us yesterday. It is not a draft agreement, but as the Secretary-General himself puts it, it is a number of formulations and suggestions. Some of his suggestions are the very ones which have already been rejected by the Argentine response to our own proposals. Even if they were acceptable to both parties as a basis for negotiation, that negotiation would take many days, if not weeks, to reach either success or failure. Mr. Speaker, we've been through this often before, and each time have been met with Argentine obduracy and procrastination. Argentina rejected our proposals. It is inconceivable that they would now come genuinely to accept those of the Secretary-General's ideas which closely resemble our own. Even if we were...
I'm very grateful to the Prime Minister. Is she aware that according to the Quaker mission at the United Nations in New York, certain members of the Security Council have prepared a document which is thought may be the basis for negotiation between ourselves and the Argentine?
No, sir, and I think that that is covered by what I have already said. These are the 7th set of proposals we have considered. We have considered them carefully. Each time we've met with tactics whose object is procrastination, leading to continued occupation of the islands. It was because of that, the record on this, that we thought it best to put up our own specific draft interim agreement in writing, so that our position was totally clear for the world to see. Totally clear to see that we were not compromising fundamental principles, but we were prepared to make some reasonable practical suggestions if we could secure the prize of no further loss of life. Those were rejected. They are no longer on the table. No, not at the moment, because the Honourable Gentleman is interrupting the flow of what I'm saying. What is being considered now is something which is called an aide-memoire, which is not a draft agreement, but which is a number of formulations and suggestions. The essence of those formulations and suggestions, where they are clear, is that they are those which have already been rejected by the Argentinian response to our proposals. I give way to the Honourable Gentleman.
Grateful to the Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker. Why have we withdrawn these proposals, even though they've been rejected by Argentina? Why can't we, right up until the last minute, why can't they stay on the table for acceptance by Argentina?
Because they have been rejected, and it's the 7th lot of proposals with which we've been involved. They really cannot go on and on. Someone has to make a decision and an assessment of the objectives of the Argentine Junta. Mr. Speaker.
Since at the end of the day, every rational man and woman knows that we cannot sustain indefinitely the sovereignty of those rocks 8,000 miles away. Why is the Prime Minister showing such extraordinary impatience that she will not continue to seek to negotiate when the alternative is carnage and blood, which will have no good effect at all?
Because the Argentines do not want a negotiated settlement. They want sovereignty of the islands and are using protracted negotiations in order to procure that objective. And I do not believe they are genuine in their negotiations. No, I think I really must.
Would the Prime Minister, Charlie, would the Prime Minister accept that there are many people who would believe that the proposals put forward by the British government are fair proposals, but there are many people who would recognise that the British government may now feel it necessary to take further military measures, but they could not necessarily understand why the Prime Minister feels it necessary to withdraw those proposals, and why those proposals cannot still be on the table and held on the table in the hope that the Argentinian government would eventually come to their senses.
It seems to me perfectly clear that if the proposals have been rejected, it is reasonable to withdraw them. What we are now considering, it is reasonable to withdraw them. They have been rejected. They are no longer on the table. What we are now considering is an aide-memoire put up by the Secretary-General. And it seems to be perfectly right. If you make an offer and it's rejected, that is an end of the matter, particularly bearing in mind that those are the 7th set of proposals which I have, in fact, been involved with. Mr. Speaker, even if we were prepared to negotiate on the basis of the aide-memoire, we should first wish to see substantive Argentine comments on it, going beyond mere acceptance of it as a basis for negotiation. These are the points we are making in our reply to the Secretary-General. At the same time, we are reminding him, as my right honourable friends and I have repeatedly said to the House, the negotiations do not close any military options. Mr. Speaker, the gravity of the situation will be apparent to the House and the nation. Difficult days lie ahead, but Britain will face them in the conviction that our cause is just, and in the knowledge that we have been doing everything reasonable to secure a negotiated settlement. The principles we are defending are fundamental to everything that this Parliament and this country stand for. They are the principles of democracy and the rule of law. Argentina invaded the Falkland Islands in violation of the rights of peoples to determine by whom and in what way they are governed. Its aggression was committed against a people who are used to enjoying full human rights and freedom. It was executed by a government with a notorious record in suspending and violating those same rights. Britain has the responsibility towards the islanders to restore their democratic way of life. She has a duty to the whole world to show that aggression will not succeed and to uphold the cause of freedom.